Sir, welcome. Joydeepe কৈছো শুনা পাইছে?
শুনিছেন নাই মোক?
শুনিছো স্যার, শুনিছো।
আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে।
আপনি বহুদিনৰ মূৰত দেখিলো স্যার, ভাল আছে?
বহুত দিন মনত আছো আৰু কি কয়, ইমান দিন যোৱা নাই, ভাল লগা নাই আৰু কোভিডৰ কি কৰিবা।
আচ্ছা, তাকে সমীৰ দাস স্যার জয়েন কৰিছে। He has already
আচ্ছা,
joined.
ঠিক আছে, very good. Yeah.
We will wait for 5 more minutes maybe, and then we will
ঠিক আছে,
start.
ঠিক আছে.
Okay.
Yeah. I just wanted to make sure everything is all right.
I know.
ঠিক আছে, ঠিক আছে.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning, Samir.
Good evening for us.
হ্যাঁ, good evening. কেমন চলছে? ভালোই?
হ্যাঁ, ভালোই চলছে। COVID we are confined to home.
Absolutely, it is terrible, I tell you. Yeah, this is the first time I haven't been to Assam for 2 years almost.
Acha, what is happening in the US? You can move around without masking yourself, or what has happened?
Well, it was for a few days, at least in the New York area, but suddenly they are changing. As you know, this new variation, the Delta variant.
Plus, yes, yeah.
So that has changed things quite a bit. But on the whole, I would say in the US, as you know, US, this matter is political, as you may know.
Yeah.
So in areas like New York, it is very good. It is much better. Yeah,
Okay.
It has almost been normal for a few days, but because of masking rules have, I think, been enforced again since yesterday. Yeah.
Great, good.
Yeah. And Kolkata kirokom?
Kolkata, as usual, we are oblivious. We are not masking ourselves, so waiting for the third wave to come. Anytime it's going to hit us.
Oh dear.
We are having conflicting predictions. Some people say that it's going to be a furious and terrible wave. But there are others who are saying that, you don't have to feel panicked. Don't panic. As usual, don't panic and then die.
Yeah. It is. All we can do is be as careful as possible, right?
Yeah, surely.
Yeah. So I feel better after being vaccinated. I got both the vaccines. So until then, I was extremely careful. I rarely went out.
Yeah, but is it Pfizer or what kind of vaccine?
এখানে আরেকটা আছে Moderna. They call it
Moderna, right? Moderna.
Yeah, I got Moderna. Yeah. I decided, after all these technical things, who knows, right? So I was going to get whatever is available.
That's the best thing. So you surrender.
Yeah, so much you can do from Google as for non-experts like us,
Right.
I guess Joydeep may be ready to start. I don't know. It's not
Yeah.
Just waiting.
Yes, almost, yes.
Okay.
Nova, okay, just no, let me check first all these things. Nabankur?
Yes, Rida.
Amar register sir join korche niki? This
Just
sir
one
to kole muk, he's tied up.
নাই স্যার তো জয়েন করা নাই
Dean sir আছে niki? Anyway, so
নাই
Sir, bhal no, Boro sir. Hi sir. Nice to see you, sir, after such a long time. Hi sir.
Very nice to see you. Very nice to see you indeed. Yeah.
Right, sir. Moi sir, KK Anticote asu, sir. So I'll be actually hosting the program, sir.
My gom na pong. That's very good. Very good. Yeah.
Hi sir. Thank you, sir.
Abhijit, we will begin. And then VC sir got tied up with some meeting. He has sent me a message, so we can begin, no problem.
So then, inaugural address.
No, inaugural, I will do the beginning and also introduce, no problem.
Okay.
Just start.
Okay. A hearty good evening to all, and warm greetings from KK Handling State Open University. I, Abhijit Bhuya, on behalf of Pujya Kumar Bhuya School of Social Sciences of KK Handling State Open University, take immense pleasure in welcoming our esteemed guests and all participants to today's lecture on the topic, Why History Matters, being organized by Pujya Kumar Bhuya School of Social Sciences of KK Handling State Open University. I'm extremely pleased to announce that on the occasion of today's lecture, we have in our midst Professor Sanjay Borua, Professor of Political Science at Bard College, New York, as the esteemed speaker, and Professor Samir Kumar Das, Professor of Political Science in University of Calcutta, as a chairperson. It is indeed my great honor and privilege to extend a warm welcome to both our esteemed guests. May I now request our director, sir, Professor Joydeep Borua, sir, Director of Khujjo Kumar Bhuiyan School of Social Sciences, to kindly introduce the esteemed speaker and the chairperson. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Abhijit. A very good evening to all of you, and good morning to Sanjay Borua, sir. Esteemed speaker for today's lecture, Professor Sanjeev Borua, chairperson of the program, Professor Samir Kumar Das, esteemed guests, participants, my colleagues and students. Good evening and welcome. I take the pleasure and privilege of welcoming you all to this online lecture series organized by Khujjo Kumar Bhuiyan School of Social Sciences, Krishnakanta Handikoi State Open University. And this is the fourth lecture in the series, and the idea of having these lectures entails impression as well as intention of providing a platform to interact with distinguished academics on diverse themes. We in the CE actually plan to host these lectures alternatively for each of the discipline, and today's lecture is being hosted by discipline of political science. Vice Chancellor Professor Kandappa Kumar Das was supposed to join us, but he has sent a message that he got tied up in some meeting. So he extends his greetings and also the best wishes for the program, as well as greetings to Sir Sanjay Borua sir and also Professor Samir Kumar Das as well. I take the honor and privilege of welcoming Professor Sanjay Borua as the invited speaker for this evening. In fact, the Professor Sanjay Borua is too well known to require an introduction. He is one of the most distinguished political scientists and commentators writing about Northeast India in particular, and political economy, nation and nationalism, Asian borderlands, South Asian politics in general. He is currently a professor in political studies, Bard College, New York, and he is almost well known for his books, India Against Itself, then The Durable Disorder, then Post-Frontier Blues, then In the Name of Nation, which is very recent, besides the other volumes like Beyond Counterinsurgency and Ethno-Nationalism in India. So I take the honor and privilege of welcoming you, sir, for this lecture. I also am very happy and pleased to welcome Professor Samir Kumar Das to chair today's lecture, who too is one of the highly regarded and very eminent political scientists making significant contributions in understanding the issues of Northeast region of India. He is a professor of political science in University of Calcutta, and he was also the vice chancellor of North Bengal University. He specializes in and writes on issues of ethnicity, identity, security, migration, rights, and justice. And his important contributions include Migrations, Identities, Democratic Practices, published in 2018, India, Democracy and Violence in 2015, Governing India's Northeast, Essays on Insurgency, Development and Culture of Peace in 2013, Conflict and Peace in India's Northeast, Role of Civil Society in 2006, and Blisters on Their Feet, The Tales of Internally Displaced Person in India's Northeast, which came in 2008, among many other writings. So without further ado, may I request Professor Samir Kumar Das to kindly chair the event and then take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Joydeep. Welcome, everybody. It's really my honor that I will be able to chair this session. Really, Professor Sanjeev Borua doesn't need any introduction. When I first read his book, which came out from the Oxford University Press, that was his first book on the Northeast. Everyone must have read it. I was quite surprised. I didn't know him. Subsequently, I came to know him, and I have read whatever writings I come across. And I had the great opportunity of conversing with him, discussing his book, In the Name of the Nation, which came out very recently. I don't know whether the Indian edition has come out. It came out from Stanford University Press. The Indian edition is expected to come out anytime soon. I don't want to anticipate the course of the discussion, but the title is very significant, Why History Matters. Because for students of politics, as we have been exchanging emails for the last few days, Sanjeevda has aptly said that for students of political science, history doesn't matter, because for us, history begins from 1950, the day the Constitution came into force. I would rather take it back to 15th of August 1947, because that's what we were told during the undergraduate days, that history ends on 15th of August 1947 and politics begins since then. I am reminded of one of Karl Marx's famous statements, thus there was history, there is no more. I think that politics which is not informed by history remains perpetually inadequate. And that's the reason why history matters, whether we like it or not. But it's important for us to understand why history matters, how it matters, and when does it matter? Does it matter at all? Does it matter on its own, or we make it matter by way of writing it? So history writing plays a very important role. And I am delighted to note that it's only in the recent years, I don't know whether Sanjeevda will agree with me, that historiography of the Northeast catches the attention of many scholars. It's only very recently. I have come across, for instance, one of the essays which came out very recently in one of the sage journals, written by a Mizo scholar. Besides this, there are also other publications as well. But I think that that how is history to be understood becomes a methodological challenge. I don't want to stand between Sanjeev, between the introduction and Sanjeevda's lecture. So without further ado, may I now request Professor Sanjeev Barua to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And good evening to everybody. And of course, as you know, it's early morning for me, only 9 o'clock. First, I want to express my profound thanks to everybody at the Krishnakanda Khandiko State Open University for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm always very happy to be in Assam, and I only regret that this is not in person and Zoom instead. But thank you. And thank you, Dean Joydeep Barua, esteemed colleagues, and Chairperson Homir Das. And I owe a particular gratitude and almost an apology to Samir Das, because when he agreed to be a discussant, I'm sure he expected there will be a paper. And there isn't. But he gave you a wonderful introduction to what I'm going to talk about and why. Here though, let me sort of start a little bit with the invitation I got from Joydeep. So when we talked, I soon realized that it'll be people from different disciplines. And then I began thinking that rather than making a very academic topic, I thought I should do something which will be of interest to a general audience there in Assam, right? And since I have written about Assam, that wasn't a problem. So I thought Assam history will interest everybody. And as Samir Das said very wonderfully, it was really till recently, political scientists really did not get interested in history very much. And in my case, what I've been reflecting actually, in fact, I have done all this over the last couple of months after I agreed to speak, that almost moment I began writing about Assam Northeast, I began reading history. So a lot of it, so in a way, I'm reflecting on why that is the case. And so I wouldn't, thanks to Samir Das, I won't have to get into further why political scientists were not doing it before. So, but doesn't mean that I have become a historian, but it's only that I read more history, right? So I will basically, what I'll do today is say, talk about a few things, and I'll give you more a sense of what I've been reading and how do I read them, right? And since, in fact, I'll share my screen soon, and you'd noticed just about an hour ago, I added a subtitle to the talk. And so you will see now that it is a very particular kind of history I will be talking about. So here is my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, wonderful. So why history matters, T, Assam, and the world. So,
Sanjita, just a minute. Is it possible to expand it and make a full screen presentation of the slide?
Full screen presentation of the
sir,
slide.
Yes, sir. At the top, there is a slideshow. And then click there. Yes.
Click there. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Click there and then go to the play from the start. If you click, play from the start. If you
I'll
click,
do that.
Yeah. Slideshow. Yes, play from the start.
Okay.
That's good.
Good?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Jyoti Borwa knows that I need technical help on such matters. Thank you. So as you can see now, I have a subtitle. And now let me go to the next slide where I talk about how I think about history. And I'm going to start with a quotation that many of you would know from E.H. Carr. And this is a book many of us have read. And in fact, thanks to the internet, I was able to get the edition, which is really probably the edition I read years ago, right? The cover of the edition. So I think here is a quotation that would help. Facts are like fish swimming about in a vast and sometimes inaccessible ocean. And what historian catches will depend partly on chance, but mainly on what part of the ocean he chooses to fish in and what tackle he chooses to use. Tackle, of course, is a little old-fashioned word. I think I can give you the Assamese translation, is because it's probably we'll call it masmar hozuri, right? It will be the right word in this context. So in what tackle he chooses to use, these two factors being, of course, determined by the kind of fish we wish to catch, right? So, and it'd be interesting to many of you that E.H. Carr, who wrote this very influential book, himself was not a historian. He didn't have a PhD, nor did he really teach history. He was working in the foreign service, in the British foreign service, and then got interested in all that, mainly in Russia. And that's how basically he wrote this influential book and developed a lifelong interest in history. So, and then here I'm adding another person, that facts really do not speak for themselves. So I don't want to pretend that, I'm trying to be objective. And I think I'm glad many historians now accept this, right? So his facts really don't speak for themselves. Historians speak for them, speaks on their behalf, and they fashion the fragments of the past into a whole. So obviously, in a very preliminary way, I'm going to fashion the fragment of the past into a whole in a somewhat tentative manner, and I hope you would be interested. So, and then I'm going to switch to a slide mainly because I approach politics, history in a particular way. And this Nigerian novelist, I think I like his formulation a lot. There's a great proverb that until lions have their historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. That didn't come to me much later. Once I realized that I had to be a writer, I had to be that historian. Of course, Chinua Achebe was no historian. He was a novelist, but you know what he means, historian in a more metaphorical sense. It's not one person's job, but it's something all of us have to do, right? So that I think it's quite interesting, his way of putting it, and very, very obviously he's a very creative writer, and many of you probably know his book Things Fall Apart, right? For which is very well known. So that gives you a sense of sort of what sort of history interests me and why, right? In a way that I have a political take, if you like, on the past. So now, here is my take on the Singphos. All of us know Singphos were heavily involved in the quote-unquote British discovery of tea. But I, more and more, I'm convinced that we should think of them as Assam's original tea drinkers. East India Company considered partnering with Singpho chiefs for harvesting tea from the forest. Tea collected from the wild, it was thought, could be a potential supplement to the tea produced in the fledgling new plantations. That idea was on for quite a while. The partnership idea, however, was abandoned, but a distinction between tea forests in tea gardens had an enduring effect on the vocabulary of tea. That is why tea plantations Assam are still called tea gardens in English and Sabagisa in Assamese, which is of course often surprises people, by the way. You may not realize, we get used to it. When people visit abroad, I know people are always surprised, why do we call them garden? They are really tea plantations, right? And plantations really evoke slavery, capitalism, whereas garden doesn't. And if you read about it historically, you know it is not accidental, right? There's a reason why. And so this is partly interesting because it is not obvious at all at the beginning whether they will really produce tea plantations themselves, because it took a while. And there was an interesting 10-year period that I'll talk about where things were somewhat unclear. So, so that's why I think the Singphos are actually more important than people often realize in the tea story. So here I'm giving you just a sense of the Singphos. Many of you know, very few people today, but you know, that's not really saying very much. These categories, as you know, in Northeast India changes. But nevertheless, right now, I think in the last census I looked up, you have 5,600 in Arunachal and 2,342 in Assam. But most Singpho activists I have spoken to say the number is actually much higher. And of course, they are known most famously as Kachin in Burma. They number about 1 million in Burma, Myanmar, and about 150,000 in China. So, and what's interesting, I actually learned from some of you would know, Meenakshi Warkatoki's work. She worked on the Tangsas in that area around Lido, Margarita, and into the Changlang district of Arunachal. That actually the Singpho was, in fact, the language actually was almost like a lingua franca until quite recently for a lot of the people there. So the numbers are actually misleading in that sense. Not only that, a number of place names are originally Singpho, including the famous town of Lido. Lido, of course, is where the Stillwell Road begins. So these are Singpho words I wouldn't have known except for Meenakshi's wonderful book, what's it called? The Dancing to the State, the ethnic compulsion of being Tangsa in Assam. So, so there's just a brief account of Sang, but fortunately, while we don't know very much about Singphos, in recent years, there's been a lot of interest on the Burmese side. And I was very happy to find and read a person called Mandy Southern, an anthropologist, who in fact, some of you would know, years ago, I had invited her to Guwahati. But at that time, she was just beginning her work, and now she has a wonderful book. So my next slide, I will draw a little bit on her book. So that's her book, Being and Becoming Kachin. So this is basically I'm drawing on her book. Singpho elites came in contact with East India Company officials regarding their pre-plan, even before Assam came under British colonial rule, that we know, right? This leads Mandy Southern to contemplate this interesting counterfactual scenario. So if you look at it from the perspective of early 1820s, it's not impossible to imagine the Singpho elites could have emerged as a new broker in a trans-Patkai tea trade. She imagines a politically fluid zone with economic network enabling Singpho Jingpao elites. And as you know, this word is tricky. That's why I'm just sticking to her term, obviously, Singpho Jingpao. So people who study Kachin, study Singpho are very aware of the different variations of the term. So they use brackets like that, hyphenated forms like that. And Jingpo, I think, is often the language. Singpo is the people, but that and these words really are actually relatively new, if you like, right? So meaning that depends on how the British first began referred to it. That's why more Singpo, not Jingpo. So it's quite arbitrary, actually. So, but I love her counterfactual hypothesis of really think for brokers and broking tea across a landscape dotted with verdant forests of tea bushes, stretching from the eastern Himalayas all the way to the trading gates of China. So I thought, and this too, still so strange to us to think like that, but this map will make it clear, right? As you can see, this is really a very close by we're talking about. There's a Khamti Singpo area, and next to it is a Kachin area. And we are so used to our national borders that we don't think like this. And interestingly, by the way, that this particular map is from a very recent articles by Berenice Guillaume-Rechard called "When Legions Thunder Past." So this article, I think many of you know probably her work. She is very kind of a new historian, but has a very important book called "Shadow States: India, China, and the Himalayas, 1910 to 1962." But that book came out a couple of years ago, and now I think she's getting very interested in the Second World War and the Patkai. And Patkai, of course, all of us in Assam know the name Patkai, but we don't sort of where we thought we know it in the context of our homes came across the Patkai, but we don't think about the Patkai enough. But if we think about it, Second World War in a way happened in the Patkai, right? After all, the Lido Road was built through Pangsao Pass, right? So Patkai is extremely important actually. And so, so it's interesting to me that Patkai in her account of the Second World War acquires more and more importance. And this map obviously is a very interesting one, right? So that I think in a way, you know, in terms of thinking counterfactually, I find it interesting. And I think it's important to do that. After all, say I read recently Amartya Sen's new book, new memoir, Home in the World. He has a wonderful chapter where he tries to sort of think that, well, he makes an interesting distinction between globalization and coercive globalization. He said he had no doubt that India was a globalized place, very open to global ideas, but there was nothing inevitable about imperialism, which he calls coercive globalization, right? So in a way, his examples are, after all, Japan globalized without imperialism, and were very open to ideas. And certainly Assam was very open to ideas. So in a way, thinking counterfactually is useful. So I find Mandy Sadan's way of thinking quite interesting, right? That a tea story could have changed very much if you think a little counterfactually. So I want here to remind you about the important 10 years in the tea story, right? Which I really say, Bruce Brothers, we all know, first observed the use of tea in Assam as early as 1823. 3 years before the Assam was British conquest of Assam. But the recognition of the discovery by the company took longer. Lieutenant Andrew Charlton, who was the main military commander in Hodia, he identified tea leaves and wrote to his boss, Francis Jenkins, about he just didn't say that tea is available. He actually gave in details the techniques that the Singpos and Khamtis use to transform tea leaves into a beverage. That part I think we often forget. They were drinking tea, they're not just tea in the wilds, right? So he gave actually details. And so that I think in terms of our kind of nature of knowledge, as we know, we tend to underestimate kind of the knowledge of people who were looked down upon, if you like, right? So it is important if you're interested in food to think about not just what they ate, but the fact that they had their technology, their knowledge, they developed to really use that food material, right? So in that sense, it is important to remember that Khamtis drank tea and had a whole way of making tea, right? So what of course, Andrew Charlton did, he sent the seeds and leaves to the newly formed tea committee, and which announced in 1834 December that the tea shrub is beyond all doubt indigenous to Upper Assam, right? That of course transformed everything. So just look at those years then, right? That's important from my point of view. So then the tea committee, which they formed, recommended that the cultivation and manufacturing of tea should be left to the enterprise of individuals to pursue the business as an objective of speculation. So you can almost imagine, right? In fact, the whole idea was that let capital come, let anybody, as a result, the fact that tea in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, attracts speculators of all kinds of companies come up, right? Only began with Assam Company in 1839, Jorhat Company soon after, and lots of companies begin coming up. So it was really left to almost kind of after all, the British were not interested in really spending a huge amount of money themselves. So it was almost opening up, making just the land available, extremely easily available, right? And we have to think about that. And so that new capital, British capital, will come in and produce tea in plantations, right? So this, I think, will interest you. I just quote a book from 1839, how the discovery was treated. Right? Clearly, it is hard for us to imagine because we live in a world of nation states. But the fact that the whole geographical imagination was imperial, it tells you how it was thought. Nobody was thinking about Assam or Singpos or anything like that, right? But the fact that it was happening within the borders of the wide dominion of Great Britain, right? So when they so that's why I underlined those. So read carefully and underline the parts and the dormant energy of a country. Country there is of course Britain, right? So the way they were thinking is very different at that time, right? It is really British energy, British enterprise, British effort, right? The fact that it was in Assam is only accidental, right? All that disappears. So that I think we tend to underestimate. So I thought this particular text captures it in 1839, right? Very early on really was, right? So a discovery was made, extremely important. And look at the way they put it. As if nature on its own planted the shrub in their territories, right? No talk about Assam, no talk about Singpos, but nature has been fortunate to the British. So now see from Mandy Sutton's point of view, who earlier on imagines how much things changes. In 1839, the creation of the Assam Company in London really changed everything from our point of view. So I'm actually finding, okay, now I can read it, yeah. Seemed to be during the, sorry, I was trying to read the earlier one here. In 1839, the creation of the Assam Company in London was soon to prevent the Singpo from becoming gatekeepers or indigenous bridgeheads for the trading of tea across the inland sea of a Panjingpo space. Instead, many of these early tea plantations absorbed Singpo lands, while at the same time excluding Singpo communities from them other than as coolie labor. So if you think about the tea gardens even now, go to the area around, Lido, Tinsukia, right? That's basically the area that she's talking about, right? So, but it was not inevitable 10 years earlier, right? 10 years earlier was not a plantation thing. So now moving our lenses from the Singpos to the Ahom king, you will see how those few years make a big difference, right? So my next plot is on what was being considered in 1833. And if you remember, 1834 was the quote-unquote discovery, right? So 1833 was still a little early. During the early years of East India Company rule, Upper Assam seemed to be a remote region with little economic potential, unlike Lower Assam that was geographically close to British rule areas of Bengal. The company showed no interest in bringing Upper Assam under its direct control. Thus, in 1833, it installed Purandar Singha as ruler of Upper Assam in return for payment of a large annual tribute. 1833. Now, see how quickly things changes. What happens then is in my next slide. But land surveys soon revealed that the territories under Purandar Singha's rule, notably the districts of Jorhat and Shiosagar, were highly suitable for producing tea. Not only were the soil and weather conditions perfect, the location by the Brahmaputra River could prove a huge advantage for meeting the transportation needs of such an industry. On the advice of Moniram Dewan, the Ahom king expressed support for the tea enterprise and a willingness to form a partnership. But once the potential for tea cultivation in those territories became apparent, Purandar Singha's throne itself came under threat. He was ousted in 1836 and his territories brought under direct British control. Right? So that I think, by the way, much of a lot of this history is well known, But in another version, I have my notes where I have citations, and for some of this I cite Joyita Horma's book, Empire's Garden, right? So so next one. I like this particular quotation because you'll see, while massive things change massively, it seems to me that the story of the Singh posts don't disappear. This is from Kalyan Sarkar. I will appreciate if anybody knows. I would love to. I think I have seen 3 important articles by him on tea, all in 1986 EPW. Right? I don't know where his work before or after. So some of you may know of him. I'll be, he seems to be more interested in the business side of things, but he also has an article on the Chargola thing in Kachar, right? Of the whole huge tea workers strike and tea workers leaving. But I don't know his work at all. But this is this article I read. I find this interesting. So this is Assam company with a nominal capital of 500,000, for which both money and management expertise were provided by some of the top brains of the city of London and Calcutta. The Assam company was unable to show any true profit until 1852, which of course only a business analyst will show that, right? He looks at their financial statements. Sometimes profit could be distributed only out of capital gains made by the company on the sale of land and seeds. Of course, to get to the land story, they got land, everything, all land was available to them almost, right? Again, tea made by the Singh post ships were brought privately by the company and made out to be the products of its own gardens to bolster up its damn tottering image. So you see how important Singh posts were, and also how non-inevitable was the transition to tea plantation was, right? So in a way, they were still getting tea from the Singh post ships, right? And selling it as if it was their own tea. Yeah. So here I move to a political theoretical point, right? Because we all know about the idea of wasteland. We don't think enough about it. And it's interesting enough, wasteland is not an Assam specific term. So here is a discussion of John Locke. So I'll go slowly, but many of you, most of you know John Locke, but his importance to the idea of wasteland, we don't think about. Locke provided a definition of waste and wastelands that was formative in the evolution of British political economy, which had a direct influence on land revenue and forest settlements of British India. While Locke criticized the conquest of already inhabited territories, this principle did not apply to territories in which settled cultivation and individual property was considered non-existent and land was lying waste, quote unquote, waste. I want you to think about this idea of waste, right? Because after all sorts of, just think about the land use in pre-British Assam, right? So think about the fact that, say, after all, say now when you think about things like reserve forests, inner line forests, right? If you look at the 19th century conflicts, many of them were hunting grounds, right? In fact, if you look at important historical work on the Mizos called cookies, etc., there are lots of names they use, but clearly there's sufficient evidence that really the initial attack on tea gardens was because of really that kind of a dispute, right? Their hunting grounds were taken away. And think about even the Ahom kings were, right? After all, not all land was waste. After all, in Scotland or Britain, not all land which is not used as wasteland. You use for woods, for all sorts of gardens, right? But there, everything, if you're not having your own field, is a wasteland. So I would say, think about the fact that our home kings use some of the Brahmaputra floodplains as palm kheti. Palm kheti was what, right? The meaning that it is not for settled agriculture, right? You use it for part of the year. Right, part of the year, and not permanent settlement. So so as a result, but in fact, I was very struck, right, the fact that, say, the area in Nonga where Tejpur University is located is called Norpam. I would love to see somebody work. How does Norpam begin? Right, palm, right, the same. So clearly, we need to really question this idea of wasteland. So going back to the quotation from Whitehead. Since wastelands existed in a state of nature where people enjoyed the fruits of the earth in common, the inhabitants could not truly claim a proprietary rights over such territories. To the equation between states of nature, common land, non-settled cultivation, and wild wastelands, the doctrine of enclosure trumped the rights of pre-existing inhabitants. So same logic applies to Assam, to the takeover of land from Native Americans in North America, to takeover of land in Australia, right? So, and wasteland is the concept, actually. So that is where I think we tend to underestimate how global the history of tea is. So then I have this interesting kind of a take by a historian, a fairly recent article, where he actually makes a direct connection, which I found interesting, between United States and Assam. Same period. The 1830s saw the rampant primitive accumulation of land in Assam by the colonial state, corresponding to the period of Indian removals in Jacksonian America, right? That period is called, after Jacksonian America is a period in America at its worst, if you like, right? The Indians were expelled there, you know, the Trail of Tears, pushed to reservations to make the land all available, right? And then also the period of kind of a white supremacy, slavery at its worst. So imagine the correspondence is making between Assam and that period of Jacksonian America. Corresponding to the period of Indian removals in Jacksonian America, the East India Company embarked on the widespread enclosure of wastelands and jungle, and the forcible expulsion and sequestration of indigenous people from the land. Large swaths of terrain in Upper Assam thus came to be converted into plantation acreage and sold for a song. The colonial government insisted on creating large plots of plantation land, setting the minimum enclosure at 100 acres. So we can see how global the story is, right? And why is he using the word sequestration? After all, the inner line pushing the quote unquote primitives back to where they belong. What really was enormous disruption of pre-capitalist kind of a relationships, pre-capitalist modes of living, right? And so the same logic by which you think land which is not used as modern, land that is used for modern property is just wasteland. So let me sort of shift to some pictures from 19th century tea plantations. And all of you who see tea plantations, see how different it looks. Beginning. This is thanks to Joyita Sharma, by the way. Her book, she got, in fact, when I reviewed the book, I made a special mention of the photographs, which you rarely do, because she found this rare collection of 12 photographs of 19th century tea plantations, which are amazing, right? The beginnings of it, that they really tell you so much. So I thought, well, it'll be nice to see some pictures of what was happening to so-called wastelands, right? Immediately. Here is C, right? After all, initially, tea was going by boat, right? There are no railways, nothing. So all the way, so you can see the location, how Upper Assam was important, Jorhat, etc., right? Right on the Brahmaputra, all the way to Calcutta, to transportation, and later on to Chittagong as well, right? So, and since I mentioned Joyita Sharma's book, I thought I should show you the cover, which also has another picture of an interesting picture. So Empire's Garden. Then here I'm moving to basically think about the global nature of global plantation capitalism was such that even the recruitment of plantation management was global. Right? We don't think like that of that period. We think about today as global. Think of this. You'll see, right? How global the plantation owner class was. And we assume they were British, but it was much more than that. And look at this carefully. Especially the abolition of slavery and the decline of sugar plantations in the British West Indies in the 1830s and 1840s set in motion a chain of migratory movements of planters. Yes, once slavery is abolished, right, they are less useful, if you like, right? They need a different kind of managers. So also they are so used to slavery. So as a result, they were looking for jobs. What do? To other parts of the colonial world. Planters from West Indies were employed in Natal, of course, in South Africa, and Ceylon. Some also went to Malaya, to sugar and coffee estates of province Wellesley, which in fact, I think in the audience, we have Onindi the Dashgupta from Malaysia, she would know. Province Wellesley, I think, is the Penang area, the greater Penang area now, part of Malaysia. While the difficulties of coffee in the 50s also caused some of the Ceylon planters to go to Malaya. When Fiji opened up in the 1870s, experienced sugar planters from Mauritius and Ceylon were attracted there. When coffee growing in Ceylon suffered a disastrous disease which ruined thousands of acres, most of the planters turned over to tea. A few joined the booming tea industry of Assam. Right? So global recruitment of the professional class, almost like late 20th century, right? But it's equivalent of it, if you like, right? And of course, it produced a very different kind of professional class. And I thought I'll show you a picture of that. White plantation staff and whites and their wives. Well, I think we tend to forget that. I think it's important to absorb it, what it was like. This is certainly it was a picture taken in Assam. Then here I'm quoting from my own book. I think Joydeep Bora mentioned my new book's India edition actually just come out. This is the Indian edition. So anyway, so I'm reading now from the book where I quote this tea planter. So tea planter George Barker found Assam in 1884 to be the last remaining district where any sort of respect is shown for Europeans. In all other parts of India, the black man is as good as the white, a fact that is speedily brought home to a newcomer. So he continued, it is here in Assam that nearly all the old rights of servility that were exacted by Europeans in the days of the East India Company are still in existence. If this doesn't make you mad, I don't know what would. And flourish to the general better feelings among the whole community. Where no heavy babu swaggers past with his umbrella up, jostling you on the way, but with courtly mien on seeing your pony coming along, furls up the umbrella, steps on the one side and salutes you with a profound salam. This is the description of many of our grandfathers or great-grandfathers. Not only that, as some of you know, my family is originated from Jorhat. I remember hearing from my father stories about how you always had to get up from your bicycle if there is a white man walking. So now, how was the story of tea told in those days abroad, right? So here is an interesting account. 50th Jubilee of Indian tea was celebrated in the spring and summer of 1887, coinciding precisely with Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Industry leaders used 1887 to highlight specifically two key events in tea's commercial and imperial history. The first moment tea arrived in Britain from Assam, 1837, right? And which are probably mostly Singpo tea. And the first time, April 1887, the tea from both India and China surpassed imports from China. So you can see what they're after, right? There's clearly competition between the powers. We are British thinking we're better than the French, right? We of course now who cares for Chinese tea? They make it in this very old-fashioned way. We produce the real modern way, right? So that is what it was celebrated clearly, right? So that is important for us to remember that tea was part of the story of the Industrial Revolution, Assam tea. So the next one will tell you. Tea's story plays popular narrative about progress, science, industry, and free trade with an imperial setting. Most notably, it shared many elements with Arnold Toynbee's account of cotton offered in his famous lectures on the Industrial Revolution published in 1884. Tea and cotton revolutions both included plantation agriculture, the substitution of machines for domestic production, and the assumption that competition rather than regulations and monopoly was a positive force that lowered costs and thus naturally created mass markets. This, for example, was how tea's history was told in the aptly titled article, A Revolution in Tea, which appeared in Chambers Journal in 1889. And that revolution in tea is mostly about Assam, right? So just think, right? So in a way, rather than thinking industrial revolution happened in Britain, one can say Assam was part of the Industrial Revolution. But that is what Industrial Revolution was. Industrialism doesn't happen in separate countries separately, right? Some places get incorporated in very unfavorable ways into the Industrial Revolution story. So this I'm quoting from an article I wrote about a few years ago in the volume edited by Amit Vaisya and Yasmin Saikia. So, but it's sort of how I think about, how I bring together in my mind these things. Where does it leave us? Capital is globe hopping, not globe covering. So James Ferguson is his term I'm using, meaning capital really hops from place to place. Wonderful money to be made from minerals, you go there, leave, go somewhere else, right? But doesn't really give you comprehensively, does anything. So in 1900, look at Viceroy Curzon. To Viceroy Curzon, Assam appeared to be an enterprising and hopeful corner of the British Empire. Amazing to read how optimistic he was about that area, right? The area meaning Upper Assam, where tea was happening, oil was happening, coal was happening. In 1900, to Viceroy Curzon, Assam appeared to be an enterprising and hopeful corner of the British Empire, because its tea plantations and oil and coal fields were becoming magnets for globe-hopping capital. The economic landscape of the global south today is dotted with many such spatially segregated and socially thin enclaves of mineral extraction and plantation crop production, right? What I mean by spatially segregated, clearly tea happens. Doesn't mean tea affects Assamese life in a big way, right? There's some few jobs people get as clerks, this, that, right? So it transforms Assam, but it is very segregated, right? And socially thin, meaning it really doesn't penetrate in some benefits of quote unquote modernization, development, right? So, I would say, so economic landscape of the global south, and Assam is not unique. Economic landscape of the global south today is dotted with many such spatially segregated and socially thin enclaves of mineral extraction and plantation crop production. The actual impact of globe hopping capital on societies surrounding these enclaves falls far short of the promises and desires generated by capital, captured in aspirational words like development or modernization. So I think of these as aspirational words, right? So I'm more interested in what development does, not in these aspirations, repeating words like development all the time. So this is from a contemporary account, right? How contemporary economic historians and others interested in global history looks at colonial era agriculture, right? Where it fits. So colonial era agriculture was organized around export-oriented cash crop production, ushering in centuries of plantation economies to export commodity products such as sugar, coffee, chocolate, tea, and cotton. Around the globe, the colonial transition to export agriculture involved taking control of people and land in Australia, Africa, Asia, and America, and Eastern Europe. Plantations typically usurp the majority of arable land. We don't tend to think about it very much. Best land in Assam is still occupied by tea plantations, right? So that will be the story about Guyana, about British, right? Lots of places, right? So clearly, this was an amazing. So we think about tea as, we became Indian after independence, but this profound fact. And when you consider this particular issue is actually a huge issue in some countries, right? After all, South Africa, when you think of South Africa and Zimbabwe, why is land an issue? Exactly for this reason. But I guess in places like Assam, we have wonderful amnesia, right? We celebrate tea plantations more than anything else. So here is another take on, I'm coming to the end of it, so I hope we'll have lots of questions. So here is basically about the whole legacy of plantation labor. If you think of plantation capitalism, 19th century globally, right? Interesting way of looking at the legacy. And here I'm quoting a person who studies it called Crispin Bates. By the end of the colonial period, probably close to 4 million Indians have become a permanent settlers in the colonial societies of Fiji, Mauritius, and Caribbean, South and East Africa, new lives for themselves and integrated into their host societies to a greater or lesser extent. Outcomes should be markedly different depending on time and place. Some diasporic Indian communities became among the most prosperous sections of society, as is the case of South Africa, Guyana, or Trinidad, where they contributed enormously to the building of modern economy. However, in other places, they were significantly marginalized and struggled to establish a foothold outside of the plantation. For example, in Sri Lanka, Assam, and Myanmar. What a global perspective. So what I do in my last slide is to try to draw conclusions from it. In fact, this is not something I wrote for today. I said this in an interview that Ornab Hoikia of Scroll did with me a couple of months ago. So this is what I said. The Adivasis of Assam are descendants of immigrants who came to Assam as part of the same 19th century migration that took Indian laborers to plantations in various parts of the British Empire, including Fiji, Guyana, Mauritius, and South Africa. The Prabhasi Bharatiya Divas now celebrates the Indian diaspora and honors descendants of those migrants who rose to become presidents and prime ministers in some of those countries. Isn't it extraordinary that the descendants of those who were indentured to work in plantations within the borders of India are now reduced to defending their ordinary citizenship rights and seeking access to basic educational and job opportunities to improve their life prospects with a borrowed idiom of backwardness and remembered tribalness. This I'm referring to the fact that in Adivasi politics now, the idea that they want scheduled tribe recognition because Jharkhandis are scheduled tribe. But when you think of it globally, it is so amazing absurdity, right? After all, tea workers were not recognized as tribe in 1900s, in 1891, 1901 census, because they thought was modern workers. How can workers be tribals? And look at the shift. I think I will end at this note, and I hope you'll have comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev, for your wonderful presentation. I guess that some questions and some comments have already been posted. So may I request Abhijit to,
Yes, sir.
To read them out for us?
Yes, sir, definitely.
Maybe that, Sanjeev, you don't have to answer them one after another. So you just take a note of these questions, and then maybe that you can make one single short kind of response, and then we'll have another round of questions, maybe from the audience. Yeah. So go ahead,
Yes.
Abhijit.
So, yes, we could see a couple of questions being posted in the chat box. So I'll read them one by one. So the first is question has been asked by Arman Hazarika. It goes like this: in current India, there is an attempt to selectively rewrite history, refuting the existing history by saying it was written within Western, meaning British prerogative. In this backdrop, in today's new India, does history really matter? Has history lost its relevance? Your comment, please, sir. This is what he asks, sir. This is the first question. And should I go on to the next question?
Yes, yes, you go ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay. So then the next question runs like this. This has been asked by Sylvia Shyam. Sir, if you don't mind, would you please recommend some good books on history of Assam? So this is just a query on her part. I mean, she needs some advice from you, sir, regarding certain books. Then another question is from Nidushmita Dora. Sir, kindly give your view on the colonial hangover on the plantation management personnel in dealing with workers and its impact on the present industrial relations scenario. Then we have one more question. It says, also, if you could give your opinion on the role of the Chinese in the tea industry in Assam. So this is the second part of the same question, sir. Also, if you could give your opinion on the role of the Chinese in the tea industry in Assam. So these are the questions that we have received so far in the chat box.
Thank you.
Sanjeev, just a second. To add to the last question, in fact, while traveling across different parts of Upper Assam, particularly the foothills, I have heard a story, maybe you can scotch it off as a rumor, that it's the Chinese who actually have taught us the art of preparing tea. Because in Upper Assam, tea plants really grew like bushes. So those remained unpruned. This technology of pruning actually came from China. I don't know, but this legend circulates widely in Upper Assam. So I think that it's a very pertinent question, and maybe that it's an alternative narrative. And the years are very significant because you know that you may link it up with what was happening in China if you consider it to be so. Thank you. It's over to you.
All right, thanks. Well, first, let me go from the bottom. In fact, what's interesting, I will almost hesitate because an extremely interesting new book, Tea and Capitalism, Andrew Liu, Assam, China Together. I'll strongly recommend it. Very new book, Andrew Liu, called Tea and Capitalism. Yeah. So you see, look, I think that essentially the story you hear from in the Fumita talked about is not off really, right? British did not know how to make tea. Right? So as a result, initially, not only that East India Company really did almost like what in today's language you'll call biopiracy. They stole somebody into Chinese places. So initially, I think there's enough evidence to show that actually the stolen things were brought from China. Is that they didn't early on. Clearly, it took a while for them to know that tea is just the same tea which grows there. right? Initially, there was a huge effort to steal things from there, from China, and bring it to Assam, right? So, and there was don't forget this bias, right? Wonderful Chinese tea versus this tea growing around, right? So the fact that there was Chinese presence, right, it was historically documented, right? That the people were working. In fact, think about, say, even words like Sinamora, right? In clearly, China, there's Sina is a part of some word for China, right? So clearly, and then so the fact that then I have also met people actually of China years ago in the Upper Assam area, people who are descendants of Chinese workers. So the Chinese worker brought, I don't know the period well enough, and especially since there's a new book, I would hesitate, right? Because in a way we are fortunate now, we can go beyond the guesswork. Right, there's a book by a book not entirely on the subject, but his argument is a little different, but still there's good news is that for those of us who are interested in history, because the first question was if history losing its relevance. Look, the long-term view of it, how can it be? I mean, human beings are like this. We get involved with something, we move on, and again we get interested in it. Right? So I don't think history can be monopolized by some political ideology for a short period of time. It looks like that at the moment. But I certainly, my long-term view of history is that this too will pass, right? Clearly, I would say, we look at the kind of brilliant historical work that's going on all over the world now, rethinking. I can't imagine the kind of, silly work that you hear in the name of new history, right? So good news is that smart people will always keep doing, right? You can't ignore them, right? So as a result, there'll be good history being written. So far from losing relevance, I would say I'm only looking forward to, I'm a little concerned about Indian historical debates, precisely because, what is history, right? Anybody can write, is that all history, right? Clearly, this is tricky, right? After all, I don't hold any card about as a historian, after all, but nevertheless, clearly there are reasons to go to archives. If you look at, say, Berenice's work that I cited, her work on Second World War, right? Can you imagine? She uses India Office Library. She uses archives in Guwahati, in Arunachal, in Burma, and Shillong. You think anything can compete with that kind of history? No way, right? So I think, so as a result, I would say quality history will remain forever, and these political fashions will pass. Even though I'm a political scientist, I really have a very low view of how these political fads and fashions, they come and go, right? So I don't think this is anything long-term. So I'm not worried about that. So, I think the Sylvia Sham's question about recommending books on history. So as you can see that clearly, my recommending books will mean I'm giving you 1 or 2 books, right? It's really not, I think it's best not to think like that, right? Because in a way, people have to take charge and even ask questions like, why am I reading what I'm reading, right? So Hujo Bhuya wrote about it, is interesting, right? So in a way, you absorb some facts, but keep in mind, everybody writes in a point of time with a particular perspective, right? So it is don't look for authoritative history, right? I wouldn't claim any of my claims to be authoritative. I'm always happy when I see new people taking over and coming up with arguments. But it's fun to build on old arguments. As a result, I would say, read from people like Hujo Bhuya to people like Bodhisattva Kaur, who doesn't have a book. Joyita Sharma's book is wonderful, right? And so that, I think, in fact, recently there's a book on tea by another originally Guwahati person, Arnab De. Arnab De is a lovely book called Environment, and I forget the whole title. So there's a lot of good work, right? So that are coming up. So you'll have to figure out what your particular interest is and then look for books, some articles, not all of them are books. So then I would say, I think I've answered, about the Duara's question about colonial hegemony. Look, fads and fashions are cute and interesting to look at. I love watching at the culture of the tea garden, but I've noticed that is also going, right? So, that's interesting about time. So I'm old enough to remember the whole tea garden, kind of a classy, trying to be British kind of a culture of the 1960s, 70s. That is going. Now, I suppose, if you look at tea managers now, my theory is that tea managers at one time were all white Europeans. Then people began to think to manage tea, you need really public school educated, sophisticated Indians. Then he said, no, you would really, anybody can do it. And then we have Hamiyas, Nepalis, now everybody's a tea manager. I'm very glad about that. right? So in some ways, it seems these myths are created. Along with these myths, you have these cultures that grow, but time again takes care of it, right? Look at the whole small tea small tea phenomena, right? Clearly, they are also, in fact, if you look at recent statistics, small tea gardens produce about 35% of Assam's tea now. It's extraordinary. So things change, right? So as I get older, I'm even more convinced things change. So I'm optimistic precisely because I guess we often can't predict how things change, right? And I see it as a positive thing, right? Because many of us are political, Sumita is political science. I'm struck by the fact that I'm in US political science. I remember in the 60s, 70s, I wasn't here, but reading, almost most of American political science resources were spent on understanding Soviet Union. Not a single person predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. It collapsed like a house of cards, right? Nobody predicted it. So look, I think we do our work because of we are interested in ideas. We all do our work. So history changes, the people's approach changes. So take that kind of a dynamic view, right? So be intellectually interested in things and then try to read and see where it leads to, right? And get in touch with people like me and others who have walked the same path, right? And we're always happy to really help young people with their thinking about these matters. Yeah. Okay, I will stop here and then take more other questions. Is it time for more questions?
So we have a couple of
another couple of questions.
Yes, so we have a couple of more new questions coming up, sir. Just been posted. So the first one is from Jahnavi Devi. She asks, the tea sector has been a major player in the economy of India in general and Assam in particular. But the condition of the tea laborers is still very vulnerable, right, from the colonial period itself. Would you like to comment on the reasons behind their vulnerable positions? And sir, should I move on to the next question? Sir?
Yes,
the next
please,
question
please.
is from Unmilan Kalita. Unmilan Kalita asks, she in fact asks two questions. First question is, apart from the imperial motive to maneuver profit, how can one look into the physical/sexual and other related excess that occurred on the tea laborers in the bagans, as most sources of colonial Assam are imperial memoirs and anecdotes? O Bidekhi Bondhu in Sameli Memsahab is an example, and how do you look into assessing such colonial non-capitalist excesses? So these two questions are from Unmilan Kolita, and the previous one was from Jahnavi Devi, sir.
Okay.
There seems to be another question.
Okay, sir. Yes.
So just scroll down, yeah.
Yeah, scrolling down is another one. This is I think I don't see any name here, sir. Maybe okay.
I
So
think
I'll read the question.
Same Unmilan Kolita.
Yeah, maybe, sir. Yeah, this is not to justify the British speculation and acquisition of large swaths of land in Assam for setting up tea gardens, but perhaps one reason it was more convenient for the British to label these vast land areas as wastelands was because when the colonizers arrived in Assam, large parts of Assam had indeed turned into wastelands due to the chaos of the more than half a century long civil war, followed by Burmese attacks, etc., which had highly decimated the Assamese population, and even previously cultivated areas and villages had turned into forests/jungles when the British arrived. And another question I see from Shraddha. One other question. So here, Professor Borua, as someone who has worked so extensively on Northeast India, what are your thoughts on the recent issue around a chapter for Northeast in Indian history books? And then the rest, I think, would be suggestions. So Sylvia Shyam has actually thanked you for your suggestions, and would keep your words in mind while looking for books. Do not go for authored books and explore more writers, she says. And then again, Urmila Kolita, you skipped my second question. I think I read out both your questions. Both the two questions I have already read out.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
So it's only to inform Sanjeevda that those who have asked questions and offered their comments have actually thanked you for your response.
Excuse me, sir. Unmilan Kolita actually has another question. I could see it now, right? Right now,
Okay.
sir. So
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
So question 2, also, do you consider there is a lack of native accounts on colonial history of Assam? Is there a need to have a normative assessment of Assam's colonial and post-colonial political history, pointing out the imperial biases? So these are the 2 questions he has raised, sir.
Thank you.
Abhijit, there are some questions in the Q&A box as well.
Q&A box.
We will
Anyway,
come to
I
that
think I
a
better-
little later. Let's take a pause.
Yeah, a little
and,
later.
Okay.
Quite a bit, and yeah.
All right.
Look, I think Kolita's point on non-capitalist excess. I don't think there is non-capitalist. I think it is capitalist. I think slavery was capitalism. American slavery was absolutely the foundation of American capitalism. So look, I think that's what you get. After all, if you really have that kind of rights, think about the kind of all the laws that British made possible, of the because what they could do to a plantation worker. Clearly, if you till much in indentured labor, if you look indentured labor contract, where really they're a contract by which the plantation owner was like your owner, right? Look, don't forget the indentured labor shift was from slavery was a very, very slight one. That's exactly why people who are earlier ran slavery ran to places like Assam, right? So as a result, the rights were enormous. Gradual changes happened, right? But as recently, if you read places like people like Rana Behel and Prabhu's work, Mahaprabhu Mahapatra's work, as recently as 1935, there were really government investigation that found people's in tea garden workers' backs signs of being beaten by the owners, right? So as a result, if you have that kind of arbitrary rights, right? So clearly these things happen. So no reason to glorify it and call it non-capitalist, right? So this excess where if you have that sort of, after all, slavery, what was slavery, right? You clearly own the person. And if you own the person have no rights, right? So whole set of laws that go with it makes it hard to claim it as non-capitalist, right? As I said, like tea and cotton was part of capitalist production. So then in terms of, say, tea workers' condition, clearly, look, I think that, change is how it happens are really very hard for us to really even prescribe. When we probably the thinkers, well, should not always prescribe. I think there's a lot to be said for being, policy focused, etc. But it also narrows your vision somewhat, it seems to me. But just think, after all, the fact that plantations, well, clearly plantations where, we British call it tea garden, we even kept the same word. Clearly, decolonization didn't mean abolition of plantation, right? So clearly, in many places, it does mean that. So the quotation I was reading you earlier about how come tea workers, immigrant workers did better in places like Malaysia and Fiji. Some of them are workers, right? So clearly, there was a shift from plantation to other ways of production. Right, other ways of production. So fact that we kept the same mode of production, right, just passed off to Indian owners, right, and the working conditions, etc. Laws, as take a long time. Think about our many of other Indian laws, right, which we now talk about, from sedition to this law and that law, all are colonial laws, right. So plantation is your classic kind of colonial crop. So it didn't really change enough. So in some ways, it is not surprising that the conditions will be so miserable, right. So in a way that if we have begun thinking like that. Now look, plantation capitalism cannot go on in post-colonial India. That kind of a thinking wasn't taking place. So clearly, I would say for many of you, it would be interesting to think about the post-colonial moment. What did we do in the post-colonial moment? What changed? What didn't change? Right? And to recognize, and it's some way, after all, it's not surprising that the idea of decolonizing, in fact, is as alive as ever. Decolonizing certainly doesn't mean a political change, right? Lots of things have to be decolonized. Decolonizing imagination, right? Decolonizing thinking, how we think of these issues, right? So a lot of people are talking about that. So in that sense, it seems to me, I think that's also one of the questions. Do I think new kind of accounts are needed? Yes, they're needed, but I don't think they come out of some magic, some wonderful new book comes out. It's not like that. It's really about thinking. I find a lot of young people think differently. So I would say a lot of different efforts will, if you remember my Chinua Achebe quotation, it is not a historian's job. All of us have to be historians, if you like, right? So in a way, some novel in Assam Assamese may be much more impact than some academic history. I find newspaper articles in Assamese extremely sophisticated on some of these issues, right? So don't underestimate intellectual life. So don't assume intellectual life happens only in universities in English, right? So fortunately, it seems to me, so if you remember my last slide I read, I quote from Kamal Kumar Tati, an Adivasi poet who is also a scientist. So this kind of alternative thinking is happening. Its point is, what do we do with it? Do we just think, no, research happens only in universities, I'll only read something from Cambridge University Press? Then it wouldn't happen. If you assume that human beings really have an urge to think about these things, right? We are all like ideas. You can't be a tea worker and have think about these issues, right? Read, Adivasi poetry, right? You will see dissent, all kinds of dissenting voices are happening. So I'm optimistic in that sense, that ideas, you can't stop human beings from having new ideas, and those ideas are there. I think sometimes institutions don't do a good job of really encouraging good ideas. All right, I think I'll stop here. I will, I don't know, I'm a little, are there more questions or?
Yeah, sir, there is one more question that I could see in the question answer box. So the first question has already been asked in the chat box, has already been attended to. It was posted in the chat box. So like Northeast chapter, Northeast India, what are your thoughts on the recent issue around the chapter for Northeast in Indian history books? That was already mentioned in the chat box. So so that is one. And then regarding the other question, as for the other question, I'll read it out. So thank you for your wonderful. This I could not read out. TAL. I don't know what it is. Would you agree that the tea industry in the foothills and fertile river valleys of Upper Assam region was achieved through, at times, cunning and at times violent, at times cunning and at times violent land disposition for the indigenous communities? Does a sense of historical grievance inform certain assertions from some of these communities? So these are the questions that we have here, sir.
Well, I think let me tie the two questions together. Look, I think I'm all for studying areas like Northeast in our classic history books, but point is how? Even the category Northeast, after all, right? My new book is called India and its Northeast. I think it's a 1960s category, right? So point is that kind of a thinking about how did the category came about, right? And why did it come about? Other important as including something. Inclusion doesn't, it is like you include something. Including won't do anything, right? Unless you think in interesting ways about it, right? Why was it excluded? What does inclusion mean, right? So what do you do with kind of histories of people who really didn't have conventional history? Do you just look for archives and repeat your same cliches that they are primitive people, they didn't write books? Or do you think differently? So it seems to me, look, institutions can go only this far, right? So but I'm glad there is a move to include Northeast India in Indian history. But I would say what it would do is, imagine the whole process, right? Discussion, politics of the discussion, what is Indian history. So unfortunately, it seems to me that I'm more, I almost feel fortunate that the world of ideas is separate from universities. Right? So I find Indian intellectual life very alive. When I pick up a Ohamian newspaper, I enjoy it very much. And so don't expect too much out of universities. They do what they do, right? But ideas are more important than universities. So I guess I'm in that sense, I don't expect too much out of it, but I'm glad it's happening. So just have faith in ideas. What happens in I think our attitude to ideas are also important, right? After all, when you grow up, we sort of think that, some fantastic scholar is somewhere else, other universities are happening. But when you think about these issues politically, you realize it is not just a matter of somebody in a fancy place somewhere else, saying important things, right? All of us have important things to say, right? And people who really have important things say, I, for instance, read Homen Borgohain quite a bit. Homen Borgohain was wonderful in terms of understanding how he, in fact, points out how tea gardens, he says in one place that they haven't spent a penny on building a well in a village next to a tea garden, right? You can't get more extreme than that, right? Not to speak of building schools, not a penny on building a well, right? So, look, there are ideas all around. I think that we really need to know how to think of them, how to absorb them in our thinking, right? And I think fortunately, a lot of new academic work really is open to such ideas, right? That really are not looking for only some standard history, some standard archival knowledge, right? You can really learn from all sorts of sources. So I'll encourage you to take that attitude.
Sanjita, if you are not too tired, can we take a couple of more questions? Because maybe that we will, there are people who would be asking one
Sure,
or two questions.
I'll be happy to, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So there's one more question here, sir.
Yeah.
Professor Borua, sir, was Assam historically treated as an extension of Bengal? Is the Northeast burden for mainland? Is the Northeast a burden for mainland India? Could you comment on it? So this is the most recent question that we have received, sir.
Okay.
I don't think we have any more questions being posted.
Okay.
Up until now, so
Look, I think that was it treated as an extension of Bengal? But clearly there was a period, if you like, right? But don't underestimate, our histories are longer, both of Bengal or of Assam, right? So there was a very short period connected to colonialism. Clearly, colonialism was trying to be efficient, right? When they were ruling Assam as part of Bengal, after all, before 1874, Assam was part of Bengal, right? So the fact that they're not interested in really education in the sense of starting huge university. They wanted a few clerks in tea gardens, in tea plantations. So as a result, there were not huge commitment to spend money on public education, etc. So after all, the achievement of tea plantation is achievement of colonialism is disastrous, right? Think of all the famines that happened, right? Think of almost as if I think Amartya Sen in his new autobiography points out. After Battle of Plassey was a big famine, and just before the British left, there was a big famine, right? So that don't forget, all the railway building, this that are connected to all of this, railway building, etc., all connected to sort of connected to tea in the case of Assam. Then think about the fact that even after all, in terms of your question about Bengal and Assam, think of the fact that as recently as in 1905, when there was the partition of Bengal, for those 6 years, Assam and Bengal was one province. It's called East Bengal and Assam. And why was it named like that? Tea plantation lobby, right? Tea plantation lobby insisted that, look, if you remove by now Assam tea was getting well known, so they wanted to make sure that Assam remains in the name of the province, right? So look, the whole colonial period is awful in all kinds of ways, economic, cultural, right? Nothing was done in the name of cultural respect. That was nobody's concern, right? So as a result, was it considered as an extension of Bengal? Yes, but only in this British period. In the long range, it is really not very meaningful to dwell on that, it seems to me, right? So, so that in terms of is it a burden? I don't know what to make of that question. Well, I think that whose burden after all, right? Look, I think that I don't want to sort of I don't exaggerate. I don't have an exaggerated view of some wonderful, well-meaning thinkers waiting in Delhi to listen to what is good for India, right? That view of policy I don't buy. That policy is that we all smart people think about what is good. There are people waiting for good ideas. There's no dearth of good ideas. Nobody's waiting for your ideas, right? So in some ways that is whose burden, this, that. So look, state is this peculiar institution that we create, right? All of a peculiar assembly of things come under particular conditions, right? So I think whose burden makes it true anthropomorphic. It's somebody's burden. I sort of don't think it's very useful to ask things like that, right? But it's certainly true in terms of historically that clearly the fact that Assam was ruled, in my new book, I talk about it as a colonial frontier province, right? Which is important. So as a result, immediately after colonial frontier, after independence, there was a lot of just think, Assam's Digboy oil was the Asia's almost earliest oil refinery, still functioning. So colonial period had no problem with oil in Assam. But what happens after independence? Suddenly they get worried about having a refinery in Assam because of China. Right? So clearly the independence early period was dreadful. Such insecurity about having an oil, right? Assam had an oil refinery in 1885. till I think about till the Gujarat oil, Assam was still India's biggest oil producing place till about 1960s. Yet hesitation about an oil refinery. So look, I think that we probably, I think one thing I will say out of all this discussion, I think we don't interrogate the post-colonial moment enough, right? Meaning what was independence, right? So clearly, if so many institutions stayed on, that independence at least has to be studied more radically, if you like, right? What did it do? What it didn't do, right? And not just in the Indian context, right? After all, as some of you know, I actually, even though I write about all this, I teach actually international relations, comparative politics, etc. So when you think about then decolonization, India may have had a huge anti-colonial movement, but not every country had an anti-colonial movement. Colonialism collapsed on its own weight, right? Essentially, after the Second World War, Britain are dying to leave, right? So as a result, think of a place that you're dying to leave. So whatever was left that British ruled as a territory became an independent country, right? Clearly, we need to think about the idea of an independent country. Why is it that in the world of 191 states, there are some places with 1 billion people, some places with 100,000 people? They're all called countries. Are they all the same? No. So in some ways, we need to think about these things more radically, that colonialism was the extremely powerful force. It collapsed like a house of cards that gave us the world of decolonization, which is a really hurriedly put together assembly under the United Nations. It is not working. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think that marks the end of the barrage of questions and comments as well. I guess that it was a great learning experience. I don't want to sum up because a presentation like this and the discussion that followed cannot be summed up so easily, but that we could raise some important questions which need to be addressed, and would love to hear the responses from Sanjeevda in future as well. But I have one or two things in mind which I want to share with you. Maybe that at some point, if we have time, you can take a couple of minutes to respond to them. One thing which came out very cogently is this, that how Assam tea, for example, became an integral part of global capitalism. That story came out very eloquently. But somehow I feel that the Singapore story was lost, in the sense that that Assam tea became an integral part of global capitalism must have elicited some responses, and we have some inkling of those evidences that the elicited Singapore response as well, and particularly some of the communities. And these responses have been documented, for instance, in the travelogues, in the tracts written by the British ethnographers come administrators. Yeah. So what was the Singapore response? I wonder. This is a question. In other words, you know, that you seem to track, it's a methodological question, because you seem to track the trajectory of capitalism along the axis of capital. There is hardly anything in terms of, for instance, tea labor, in terms of, for instance, the tribal communities that were uprooted. So that's one part of the story. So I would say that you have told perhaps the half of the story. Where is the other half? And maybe that at some point you'd be letting us know what the other half was doing. Yeah. So this is my first kind of reflection. I'm not very sure whether I make sense, but I would sort of keep arguing. Yeah. And as a corollary to it, you know that it has a lot to do with the way, for example, capitalism and plantation capitalism works, because you know that it also has to do a lot with labor economy, and how and the question came out very well. For instance, that is there anything specific in terms of the labor economy which gave Assam tea, its global capitalist character. So where is the story of the labor? And particularly, for instance, in current writings on capitalist development and how capitalism develops, we have the stories of primitive capital. We have also the stories of need economy, quote unquote, and how it gets integrated into the global capitalism. I remember one of my colleagues' book, Kalyan Sanyal's famous book, Rethinking Capitalist Development. Yeah. Kalyanda died an untimely death.
I've read that. Yeah.
But the book is very interesting in the sense that how, for instance, that the more capitalism progresses, the greater the labor is thrown into penury. And apparently, that labor has a sequestered existence, having nothing to do with the way capitalism progresses. But he was the one who actually tried to establish a kind of linkages that is shared between these two. So I think that this is, I'm not sure whether that can actually be sort of shedding light on plantation economy of the Northeast, because he hasn't touched upon the Northeast. But I guess that would be a good food for thought. This is one comment. The second is about this Westland and the Lockean idea of Westland. I think that plantation has also a lot to do with the lived land of the people as well. And there probably colonial capitalism invoked the doctrine of eminent domain, because land finally belongs to the state, even if you own it. This and that actually explains why, for instance, in 1894 that law came into existence. It says that the state can actually acquire law at any moment without showing any reason or showing the reason of public purpose. So I think that the eminent domain is a very important concept in this context. Yeah. So this is my other thing. The third thing which comes alongside the concept of Westland is this, that how do tea gardens or how are tea gardens linked up with border conflicts, for instance? Because after all, you have to think in terms of expanding tea gardens and constantly expanding tea gardens, and they are located in the foothills, and foothills are the contact points between the plains and the hills, and they are the burning issues as well. Think of, for instance, the interstate border disputes in the Northeast. Much of it has a lot to do with the way, for instance, the tea gardens expand or the tea gardens contract, for instance. I think that's another important point. And finally, one important point, the branding of Assam tea, for instance. I think it's just my conjecture, because I haven't worked on that the way, for instance, Assam tea is branded is different from the way, for instance, Darjeeling tea is branded. The thick volume of Assam tea, we call it liquor, now has a particular constituency of consumers in the world, and Darjeeling tea is basically for the elite. So this branding becomes very important. I remember having met a planter in Upper Assam many years back, who actually vociferously disputed when I suggested to him that Assam tea is very, very sort of thick and dense, and it doesn't have a flavor. He disputed it. He said that this is the way, for instance, the colonial branding has happened. And he actually sort of made me test a kind of tea which is grown in one of the Assam tea gardens. And he said that now you tell me whether it has flavor or not. And in other words, that this flavor liquor kind of dichotomy must have its impact on the way, for instance, Assam tea got integrated into the global tea market. I think that that could be one axis of inquiry. I think I should stop here, but let me, in sum, I must say that it's a great learning experience, and maybe that we would be very soon sort of see the publication of some of your thoughts and would love to read them. But if you have anything to say, to respond, you can.
Yeah.
Because I always think that the speaker must have the last word to say.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I think I will have a couple of short things. One, I would say your eminent dominant point is very interesting, but this will interest you. Arnab Dey's book, recent book on I forget, environment and plantation or whatever it's called, on Assam basically. What I learned from it is that actually when the Assam Forest Department was constituted in 1870, Forest Department is extremely upset that they hardly have any land. All land have already gone to the plantations. So the Forest Department is a late comer, as he puts it, to the wastelands of Assam. Imagine, right? And that we tend to underestimate. So essentially, Assam tea planters were the biggest landowners by the time Forest Department started in every district. Not every district. He says every district, but I think he means a particular way. But what is interesting then is that, as you know, right, it was made so widely available, most tea plantation had way more land than they wanted to cultivate. They still have more land than they cultivate, right? So essentially, I would say it was really a free-for-all kind of a situation so far as European tea holders are concerned. So tea planters got land as wasteland, I would argue, prior to the eminent domain idea. Right? It was because very early on tea began. So it didn't even have to start there, right? It would say, the whole, what do you call the Wasteland Act, all the laws, right? When I read one or two of them, I haven't really studied them closely, you don't get a sense of eminent domain then, right? You get much more of a sense of the Lockean wasteland idea, if you like, right? So Forest Department, etc., by the time it comes, yes, you do get the idea of that state should be in charge of the public land, right? But Assam's plantation work is really kind of primitive capitalism in a wild sense, right? Almost primitive capitalism without the state is the impression I get when I read about 1930s, 40s, 50s, right? That's why they have massive speculation. So on your point about Singpo is extremely well taken. However, I would bring together two of your points. The point about, say, look, there is no doubt that almost, say, after all, we assume now the borders were given, and as a result, tea plantations are in the plains. It wasn't. In fact, inner line, Bodhisattva's argument is that inner line was really a constantly fluid thing, right? It was extremely interested to make sure that they get more and more land into tea plantations. Now we may call it Nagaland, Assam, etc., but it's not clear at all. So inner line was extremely fluid, meant to protect tea plantations, right? I didn't want to spend money and administering those areas, right? So as a result, you're absolutely right that many of these border conflicts are indeed connected to the politics of tea, right? So earlier on, it was simply really what, if you read the 1860s, 1870s. So what that time was really a primitive expedition against tribals, quote unquote, are in its modern formulation is border dispute, precisely because we made the inner line into interstate border. Who would have thought? Look, I'm completely convinced the British colonials will be turning on their grave. They never thought they knew Assam so well that their inner line will stay on for 100 years, right? So, and then not only that, we kept it, and now we make it interstate border, right? It's bizarre if you think. They would really, I think they really were improvising, constantly improvising. They didn't think they know the place, right? And now we kept the laws, kept the inner line, kept the entire colonial territorialization. Right? That tells you how problematic it is, right? But that, though, is connected to your point about Singpos. I have been struck by the fact that in everybody, in say, even the French visitor in 1750s, Chevalier or something, I think I read him. Everybody was interested in Assam only because of Patkai. They are not interested in Assam. They wanted to, they heard about how much trade happens in Assam, right? So that they were extremely, that's why they all missionaries land up there far north, the East India Company lands up there first, Hodia, etc., precisely because of that interest. Everything stops because once Assam becomes a frontier of capitalism, right? Then protecting tea becomes most important. So in that sense, the Singpo story gets blocked by the actual development of plantation capitalism. but that's only a small part of it. So you said I have half the story. I will say not even half the story. It's not even a quarter of a story, right? There are many stories to be told, right? I just was sort of recently began to think about one particular angle to it. That's all I will say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjibda. I liked the linguistic style. I haven't said anything, but I like your linguistic style and your point that we must learn history from everyone. And history is nobody's monopoly. History is not the monopoly of the professional historians within courts. I like it very much. I mean, that's the greatest takeaway from today's presentation. Thank you very much. So it's over to Jahnavi Devi, who will be proposing a formal vote of thanks to us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Pujya Kumar Bhuyas School of Social Sciences, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks to the Vice Chancellor of this university, Professor Kandappa Das, for encouraging and guiding us to organize such kind of academic event. We are also very, very thankful to Professor Sanjeev Barua for accepting our invitation and deliver it up on a topic of great academic importance. And I'm very sure that, sir, all of the participants are highly benefited from your observation. Thank you, sir. I'd like to also extend our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Samir Kumar Das for moderating today's session. And we are also thankful to the IT cell of the university for their technical support. And lastly, I'd like to express our gratitude to the participants who, with their active participation, have made this event a successful one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll stop here. Huh? All the best.
Thank you, sir.
okay.
Samida, thank you very
sir.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will probably